You mentioned a specific address as the birthplace of hip hop. And a couple of years ago, I went to a museum exhibition in Manhattan, and it was all this wonderful photography of the birth of hip hop through the 70s and 80s, the evolution of hip hop. And in that display was a little postcard that was the invitation to this party in the Bronx. And it said, "This is the first hip hop party." And it just felt like you're kind of stumbling across Magna Carta. Like, how was this held on to? How do we still have this? But tell our audience how we can pinpoint the actual origin date and place of hip hop.
So this is still going to be something that's going to be debated for many, many years. So let me just set the record straight. So that postcard turns out with my curators and the research team that we've put together was not the actual card. That was actually fabricated. So, yes.
Controversy. Okay. Wow.
Controversy.
A fake Bill of Rights. Okay.
A fake Bill of Rights. However, Kool Herc is the godfather of hip hop, but he actually was playing years before that in other parties. So we got documentation that he played even way before that so-called first day that hip hop started on August 11th. He was playing hip hop before that. The reason why people point to August 11th, 1973 is because at that particular party, the combination, not just of what he was playing in terms of music, it was the combination of the dance that connected. And when he was playing those break beats, the B-boys emerged from that party. The actual first breakers emerged from that party. So it's the assemblance and the combination of what Herc was playing in terms of the break beats, but it's also the reaction to the crowd and the style of dance that came out of that started to become what years later would become called hip hop. It wasn't even called hip hop in 1973. It was called the jam, a party, a disco event, all these other terms. It was not called hip hop that time. So it grew into what would be called hip hop years later.
Do you subscribe to the theory that we call it hip hop because in Rappers Delight they say the hip, the hop, the hippie, hip hop, you don't stop, or is it something different than that?
No, it's totally something different than that. So Love Bug Starsky and Keith Cowboy Wiggins, those two are responsible for the terminology hip hop. It didn't. What you heard from Rappers Delight was actually sampled and stolen from what others were saying in nightclubs in the streets before that. They picked it up and used it to their benefit, but it's okay. That's all right. We're not going to complain about it because it became what it became, and it was one of the biggest records in hip hop of all time.
So the origin of the music in 1973, is it taken from Caribbean music? Is it taken from R&B? Is it taken from soul? What are the threads that lead to 1973 turning it into, as you said, the break beats and this kind of party jam?
Yes, so interesting. I'm going to say this loud and clear. The godfather of soul, James Brown. If it wasn't for James Brown, this culture would not be as energized as it became. It was those drum beats from James Brown, the funky drummer, Give It Up and Turn It Loose, Sex Machine, and I could go on and on. James Brown became the most sampled man in hip hop. And there's a reason for it, because the kids like myself that were playing all kinds of records, that was the music that really inspired us when we were younger. So James Brown, funk, anything that came after James Brown, Parliament Funkadelic, Kool and the Gang, Sly and the Family Stone, all that stuff played a significant role in the development of hip hop music.
And so the break dancing also, what is that in 1973 or wherever we're going to tab? Okay, this is the moment where break dancing is created. What's the dance origin? What's the DNA of that dance where it has to be adjusted a little bit, but here's where those moves and that breaking comes from?
Yep. So think about this. The 70s, The biggest thing in music during the 70s is not what we call hip hop. It's disco, Donna Summer, right? The Bee Gees. Everybody in the club is doing the hustle, the kind of dance that you see in Saturday Night Live with John Travolta. But the kids in the South Bronx weren't doing the hustle in these kind of parties where the energy was so electric. They were forming these ciphers, these circles, and it became competitive. They would go down to the ground. It was called go off. It wasn't even called breaking. It was just you were going off to the music that you heard. So long story short, it was the energy from just playing bits and pieces of records, not even the entire record, just repeating loops of small samples, the break parts of records that really caused the excitement and the enthusiasm that these kids in these little community centers and small school auditoriums were really fascinated by. That was what brought everybody together. So in essence, it's a combination of everything, because think about this. When I was a DJ and like Flash and so many other DJs, what made us so popular was that we would go out and search for all kind of records. Manu Dibango, Soma Costa, the incredible bongo rock band, Apache, Babe Ruth, the Mexican. All these records became seminal parts of the early days of hip hop. And those are not just breakbeat records. Those are rock and roll records. Those are jazz records, Bob James. All of these things were put together and became part of the evolution of the music. And long story short, that's why hip hop, I think, is so popular, because it infused all of these different music genres together to become what the culture is known for.
You mentioned Grandmaster Flash, and he is one of those iconic names, a Mount Rushmore kind of guy when it comes to the origin and creation of hip hop. I always wondered, where do the Grandmasters come from? That terminology, because you got Grandmaster Flash, Grandmaster Cass. You have a lot of that kind of terminology. Where does that stem from?
Think of comic books and superheroes, right? So a lot of us were reading comic books and we created all these fancy names. But the first Grandmaster in New York City is a DJ from Brooklyn. His name is Grandmaster Flowers. And he was one of the first black mobile disc jockeys. And he was one of my favorite DJs of all time, by the way. Flowers, his mixing style, he didn't cut and scratch like Flash and them. Flash and them really created and did something very innovative and something different. But his blending and his style of music was unbelievable. So Grandmaster Flowers is what the rest of these Grandmasters got their name from.
Well, that's interesting.